Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. You can join Brian Curtis and myself for the stories making news and moving markets in the APAC region. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app. Let's get to our guest. Todd Walsh is with us. He is the CEO of Alpha Cubed Investments. Todd is normally based in California. Today we find him in New York City. Todd, good of you to make time to chat with us. I think we can agree that seemed like a lot of panic selling at the early part of last week. Things have settled down. What do you make of the gyrations that we saw? Was this all about an unwind of the yen carry, or is there something else happening here?
Well, hey, Doug, thanks for having me on. And of course, trees don't grow to the sky, right? We've had 18 months of a torrid increase in the AI ecosystem tech sector stocks. So, we've all been expecting a little bit of a correction. We got it. We've been looking at questions about, where is the ROI going to be coming from on all the CapEx that's going on out there? There's an element of this is kind of normal, but, when it happens, it doesn't feel normal. And of course, we have the CPI print coming out. We think we're going to see a little bit more volatility ahead. It kind of feels like we're at the doctor's office in the waiting room right now.
Okay, so if you're expecting some volatility tied to that report on consumer prices, is it possible that we don't get a market-friendly report, which is to say something that confirms that inflation is cooling at the same rate that we have been expecting?
Well, don't say possible. Anything's possible, right? The biggest issues, if we stop and really think about what's going on, we kind of need to thread the needle a little bit here. If we get a strong CPI report, meaning, it's not coming down, CPI's up, rate cuts could be off the table, and we know that's bad news for the market. But if we get a weak CPI report and we start leaning more towards an actual recession, that might even be worse for the markets. We did a little study of initial rate cuts when the Fed starts cutting rates. Since 1983, the market's up about 21% in the first year after the first rate cut. But that's only if there's no recession. After the first rate cut, when there is a recession, 2001, 2008, the market was down an average of 15%. So we are looking for what's been happening up to this point, which is marginal slowing, marginal deceleration in the economy with some mixed positive economic data to kind of back that up. And what we want to see again is marginal decrease in that inflation number. We kind of need the right kind of inflation number to get where we need to get here. We think we're going to have it.
So I hear what you're saying when it comes to kind of an economy that's shifting into lower gear. All we have to do is remember the market's response to that relatively disappointing employment report for the month of July. And I hear what you're saying, too, about the lack of ROI when it comes to AI. But I'm wondering whether or not what we have viewed principally in the market up until this point has been confined to, let's call it a market event rather than a macroeconomic event. To go back to the question that I asked at the top of the conversation about the unwind of the carry trade in yen and whether or not this revealed a lot of leverage, and maybe a big part of that leverage was tied to your trade on AI.
That's possible. We still aren't out of the woods yet. And one of the possible catalysts for volatility does revolve around that carry trade unwind. Are there unknown victims out there? Is there leverage that we don't know about? But underneath the surface, the recovery that we saw last week was, enjoyable. But the daily technicals, relative strength, momentum, money flows, a lot of the daily technicals we look at, they are all still in the negative and they haven't crossed into the positive yet. And on top of the CPI report, Iran seems intent on retaliating against Israel, and that's a big unknown. We've got a lot of catalysts for volatility. Sell-offs are a lot like earthquakes, right? We want to watch for aftershocks, and let's not be too hasty about going right in and buying because the skies have cleared. We think we've got a little more volatility ahead, most likely.
We saw a big move in crude oil in New York today. We were up more than 4% in the regular session. A lot of this is the market really braced for Iran's response to that assassination that took place in Tehran of the Hamas leader. Talk to me broadly about the commodities trade right now. Do you want to be exposed to commodities if you're assuming a downshift in global growth?
You've got a short-term catalyst with what's going on geopolitically, but we don't think commodities are the place to be. In fact, we think the Fed is going to achieve their desire to cut rates. When they pivoted back in November of last year, the value dividend trade caught fire, and for the first time in about 2 or 3 years, that trade that had been left for dead has actually returned almost the same amount since that November pivot as we've seen in the white-hot NASDAQ 100. They're both from that date up plus or minus about 25%. And you know what, Doug? I don't think most people know that. And now if the Fed moves to a more dovish stance and starts cutting rates, we might have the wind at the back of that trade for, a year or two as the Fed tries to achieve their dot plot goal of getting, rates down to potentially 2.5% over the next 2 or 3 years. So we like value. We like the dividend trade right here.
As I'm listening to you, I'm looking at the bond market and wondering whether there's opportunity there as well.
There may be some short-term opportunity there. In general, though, we think it's going to be marginal. The key word again is marginal. On the interest rate front, we don't think rates are going to come crashing down. We think the Fed's going to achieve its goal and marginally bring down rates. The Fed funds futures, I think last week, we're looking at about 100% expectation for a 50 basis point rate cut. Where are they at today? Now we're 50-50. I think as we go through as investors, we need to think, catch our breath and think things through. Our thesis this year was hold tech, but look for volatility. Let's not pay too much. Let's slow down a little bit. Trees don't grow to the sky. The value dividend trade has the wind at its back, but we don't think it's going to be an aggressive move. We think it's something we can participate in marginally. And the same holds true for the bond market. Bond market's been inverted, depending on which time frames you're looking at, for a very long time. We think the Fed is going to achieve its goal of bringing rates down, and that'll happen all the way across the curve. But the farther out we go, the more marginal it's going to be. So the answer is yes, but again, marginally.
So how do you know when to enter any market if there is a lot of volatility? I mean, you expect, let's say, whether it's stocks or bonds, you expect those assets to trade in a certain range. How do you know the entry point? I know we're talking about timing here, and most people don't like to discuss timing a market, but that's essentially what you're describing, isn't it?
Yeah, I love that question. It's the $9 trillion question out there right now. On the AI ecosystem, the tech index, everybody wants to know, when do I get in? How do I get in? Most investors, let's face it, and a lot of professionals kind of missed out on the bulk of that trade. The only way to enter that trade is dollar cost average using volatility, just incrementally move in. But we think of the market as almost two big chunks. There's the AI ecosystem tech trade, which the valuations got astronomical. We're seeing some consolidation there. And we can slowly dollar cost average into some of those areas for people coming in with new money. The rest of the market, the other 493 stocks, which I call the forgotten 493, there's value in that value trade. So we want to enter that trade sooner rather than later.
Todd, we'll leave it there. Always a pleasure. Thanks for making time to chat with us. Todd Walsh there, CEO of Alpha Cubed Investments, joining us from New York. Well, Alphabet's Google is holding a major event tomorrow for a tech hardware launch. We have a preview from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
Google is trying to outshine Apple's annual iPhone launch and is letting longtime executive Rick Osterloh take center stage. He's the former president of Motorola who joined Google in 2016. He will helm the first major product launch after the company this year unified under his leadership the teams developing hardware and the Android operating system. In a sign of a more aggressive push into consumer devices, Google moved up its annual flagship Pixel smartphone launch to August from October, preempting the next Apple iPhone debut. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Well, let's take a closer look at the Google Pixel story with our own Bloomberg Tech editor, Vlad Savov, joins us from our studios in Hong Kong. Vlad, it's always a pleasure. Are we going to be overwhelmed or underwhelmed tomorrow? What do you think?
I think both are extremes. There's always a shade of gray with these things. I do believe that one of the interesting things with Google this year is how far ahead they're going to be in terms of their own design and camera technology and so on, that's kind of been gone under the radar. I do feel like the company is very confident about the hardware itself. And although these things have kind of become commoditized, it does have a leadership as far as camera software goes. And if the thing that happens, which a lot of people are anticipating, is that Google is going to increase sales, I feel like there will be much greater awareness of all the things, all the strengths of the Pixel line to date, on top of all the AI stuff. So immediately after the event, I guarantee you will not be overwhelmed. But I do feel like a lot of people will see some of these strengths that just the world hasn't known about with the Pixel line to date.
Do you think there's a change inside Alphabet when it comes to the smartphone? I mean, developing your own technology on the hardware side? It seemed like that they were maybe a little bit more willing to allow some of the other companies like Samsung, I'm thinking of primarily, to take the lead on that front. I mean, I know that the Pixel story has been out there for a while, but it never felt as though the company was being super aggressive here. Is that beginning to change?
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a major change when you think about it. I was just thinking, Google had an event here in Hong Kong launching one of its smartphones in 2011 under its own brand. So, like you say, it's been going for a very long time. But when you launch your phone in October, what you're saying is everyone who wanted an iPhone already has an iPhone, so you're giving up on that audience. Samsung refreshes its devices early in the year, and then around this time, July, August. So you're kind of the afterthought for a whole bunch of people. Coming in the middle of August, coming a month ahead of the iPhone, says we're going to compete directly against Apple. We're going to compete directly against Samsung too. Even though Google, Rick Osterloh, we mentioned, he's the leader now. He went immediately, as soon as he got the new job, to talk to Samsung to signal that the partnership and the collaboration with the two companies is as strong as ever. But the signal is the release date.
You know, the elephant in the room, I think we can agree, is artificial intelligence, right, when it comes to the handset. I mean, we know that that's what Apple is trying to build in terms of hype for the launch of the iPhone 16. Do you think we're going to get kind of a sense of that from Google tomorrow, where the company is going in terms of the smartphone being a device where artificial intelligence is kind of baked into the cake?
Oh, absolutely. And in all the teasers that Google has done for this event, it was Pixel meets AI, which is a fun thing to say because Google is one of the companies that has been putting AI into smartphones for years and years now. Its own camera software is all about AI and machine learning, but you have to now put it front of mind for everybody. Samsung has been doing the exact same thing. They talk about Galaxy AI every time they talk about their products. Google, likewise, Apple with Apple Intelligence, that's going to be the theme, at least for the next year or two. Everyone is going to turn AI as the selling point for devices. And the devices we're talking about, smartphones and laptops, most people already have one. So each company in the industry now sees AI as the big selling point to get us all to upgrade those devices.
Isn't there the risk, though, when you jump in whole hog like this, so to speak, that as the technology changes, that you have to do a major kind of re-engineering or kind of a major tweak to a device like a smartphone that needs to kind of incorporate a lot of this AI technology so that the first generation maybe is going to be kind of radically different from the next generation?
Yes, and as far as the companies are concerned, that's great news. That means they're going to upgrade next year as well.
Right. So if it's a driver of sales, planned obsolescence, I think that's what they call it, right? What are some of the things that you're looking out for in particular?
Well, it really is this whole integration of hardware and software. And I would actually say the ecosystem play, again, comes to the surface as a very important thing. Samsung set out its stall much in the same way that Apple did, and we kind of expect Google to do the same thing. Google already has its Pixel Watch. It already has its own in-house design processor. Going back to the first thing I mentioned, Google has been putting all the pieces together. It's just most people don't know about these Pixel phones and the whole lineup. So in this event that's coming up, we're probably going to get another watch. We're probably going to get several smartphones. And it's the ecosystem of devices, it's the way that they work together. Also, don't forget, under Rick Osterloh's leadership, you have Google Nest, which are the home devices, home cameras, such things, thermostats. You have a whole bunch of other home devices, personal devices, all the internet software. If Google makes all these things work together as seamlessly as it hopes, there'll be a lot of people who can be swung to the Pixel side of things.
Is this a device that will have an opportunity in the China market, do you think?
Zero. Google services are not there. The Google Play Store, which is a real big selling point for Google because that's where you get all your international apps, it doesn't play there. And the Chinese smartphone manufacturers, let's give them their own due credit. They are right up there in terms of camera technology. They have their own app stores. They have WeChat and an entire ecosystem that Google has no presence in. So unfortunately for Google, the world's biggest smartphone market, where Apple is a big player, is out of bounds.
Do we know anything about the part suppliers here and where this device is being kind of created or manufactured?
Well, Foxconn tends to be the company that Google has worked with in the past. It does its manufacturing in Vietnam, in Taiwan. Taiwan is actually plays host to Google's hardware engineering hub. We can remember that Google took over HTC smartphone design team. They took on a bunch of design and engineering people. So you can say Taiwan plays a really big role in developing all of this.
So very quickly, Vlad, what markets in Asia might Google kind of target for this new Pixel phone?
Japan, absolutely. Japan has always been a really big market for Google. It has good relationships, and one of the interesting things in Japan is that the Chinese players don't have that much of a presence, neither does Samsung, so it has the biggest opportunity there. It's a developed market. There's a lot of potential there.
Vlad, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for making time to chat with us on this launch tomorrow taking place for the new Google Pixel phone. Vlad Savov, Bloomberg's tech editor, joining us from Hong Kong. So we know that the Democrats are rallying around Vice President Kamala Harris and her running mate Tim Walz. Walz, you may know, has had a long history with China. He taught English in China in 1989 and 1990, and since that time he's visited at least 30 times. Let's take a closer look now with Michael Sobolik. He is Senior Fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. Michael, good of you to make time to chat with us about this story. Do you have a sense of how Mr. Walz's backstory regarding China may play out in this campaign?
Yes, Governor Walz is really unique. He has so much personal experience living in China and working in China, far more than the average American politician and far more than the average vice presidential candidate. It could cut one of two ways. On the one hand, Governor Walz, by all accounts, has one of the strongest records on China human rights that we've seen from any member in the House of Representatives in recent memory. When he was a member of Congress, he got photos with the Dalai Lama. He and his wife literally got married on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre on June 4th. So he has a strong record on being publicly vocal on the need for human rights in China. On the other hand, he's also an equally vocal proponent on engaging China and promoting exchanges between Washington and Beijing. And in this day and age where national security concerns tend to trump a lot of others, it's unclear how those two competing priorities would play out for him.
You know, it's very interesting because there was an article written back in 1990 after he returned from teaching in China. I think it was the Star Herald, maybe in Minneapolis. And he was quoted as saying, if the Chinese people had proper leadership, there are no limits on what they could accomplish. They are such kind, generous, and capable people. They gave and gave and gave to me. That was 1990. Relationship between the U.S. and China, very, very different these days, isn't it?
It is as different as it could possibly be, but I'll say this. Governor Walz, like when he wrote those words so long ago, tapped into something that is still true today in 2024, which is the Chinese people are not the enemies of the American people at all, nor should they be. I've been to China as well, and I've experienced that same hospitality and generosity that Walz experienced when he was there too. And I think many Americans would attest to the same thing. The problem for Washington policymakers is not the Chinese people, it's the Chinese Communist Party. And that distinction is quite meaningful. And I am gratified greatly that Governor Walz recognizes that difference.
Yeah, that's an important distinction to make. But in terms of influencing policy, imagine a world where Kamala Harris is the next president. Is it the role of the vice president at all to kind of get involved with setting the agenda?
So that's going to vary from administration to administration, to be sure. We've had vice presidents like Dick Cheney, who were one of the most prominent presences in any room and played a major hand in national security. I think Vice President Joe Biden, when he served Barack Obama, in some cases fit that bill as well. If Kamala Harris wins the presidency, that'll be her decision to make. But ultimately, if she wins, she is going to face this million-dollar question in American foreign policy. Is China, the Chinese Communist Party, a potential competitor or an adversary? And Xi Jinping, the leader of China, is not really leaving America with much of a choice. We're going to have to choose one or the other.
How do you imagine Beijing would react to this type of situation where you have someone in the administration who knows so much about China?
I think they'll probably try to play this much like they have attempted to work with President Joe Biden. So President Biden talks regularly about how many hours he spent meeting with Xi Jinping when he was Barack Obama's vice president. And that was quite intentional. Barack Obama and the U.S. government around 2012, even as early as 2010 and 2011, knew that Xi Jinping was the heir apparent in China. And Joe Biden spent a lot of time cultivating a very personal relationship with Xi Jinping. And what not just Xi at the most highest levels, but what Chinese diplomats will often do is try to fall back on mutual feelings of friendship and cooperation and shared cultural experiences to try to get American politicians to give a little bit on the competitive agenda. I am certain they will try to do the same thing with Walz if he assumes the vice presidency. In fact, as governor of Minnesota, he's already received some of those diplomatic overtures.
So we know, and you mentioned that Walz's record when it comes to human rights, particularly in China. How do you think he's going to frame the conversation around the South China Sea?
So he's on record as a member of Congress saying that the United States needs to stand up to China and call out their illegal territorial claims in the South China Sea. And listen, that's great. We need to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for their illegal actions with our rhetoric. But we are at a point in our security situation where we need to move beyond words. We need to start making the Chinese Communist Party pay for endangering the security of our allies and our partners, and frankly, American interests in the South China Sea. And this is the big question with Governor Walz. He has a strong rhetorical record on human rights with China, but he hasn't, in the position of a representative, really been in a position to make those hard executive level decisions on how do you assess those trade-offs? Because if you want to hold them accountable, you're probably going to have to give a bit on the cooperative agenda with Beijing. And it's really unclear how he's going to make that calculation if he wins this election with Kamala Harris.
I'm sure that this topic will come up during the vice presidential debate. Michael, thank you so much for making time to chat with us. Michael Sobolik, senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. He was speaking to us from right outside the District of Columbia in Alexandria, Virginia. This has been the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast, bringing you the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to get more episodes of this and other shows from Bloomberg. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.